The date was December 26, 1944. The small Belgian town of Bastogne was completely surrounded by German SS divisions, their black uniforms a stark reminder of the Nazi war machine's ruthless efficiency. Inside the town's frozen perimeter, 11,000 American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division had been cut off for 6 brutal days, running desperately low on ammunition, medical supplies, and hope. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and German artillery shells fell like deadly snow every few minutes. These men had been holding the line against impossible odds, but they were dying. Fast. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary military turnarounds in human history. A single radio transmission, 5 minutes of orders from General George S. Patton, and suddenly everything changed. But this isn't just a story about military strategy or battlefield tactics. This is about how one man's audacious decision to break every rule in the military handbook saved thousands of lives and altered the course of World War II forever. Because what General Patton ordered his Third Army to do that frozen morning was considered militarily impossible by every expert, every general, and every strategist in the Allied command. Yet somehow, it worked. The story begins 3 weeks earlier, when Adolf Hitler made one of his most desperate gambles. The Führer had convinced himself that one massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest could split the Allied forces, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force Britain and America to negotiate a separate peace. He called it Operation Watch on the Rhine, but history would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler committed his last reserves to this attack, 200,000 German troops supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, including the massive Tiger IIs that struck terror into Allied tank crews. The German offensive began at 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944. Along an 85-mile front, German artillery opened up with a thunderous barrage that could be heard 20 miles away. Then came the tanks, rolling through the morning fog like mechanical monsters, their guns blazing. The initial attack was devastatingly effective. American forces, many of them new recruits who had never seen combat, were completely caught off guard. Entire units were overrun in minutes. Within 48 hours, the Germans had advanced 20 miles into Allied territory, creating a dangerous bulge in the American lines. But Hitler had made a critical miscalculation. The road network in the Ardennes was limited, and the success of his offensive depended on capturing key transportation hubs quickly. The most important of these was Bastogne, a small town where 7 major roads converged like spokes on a wheel. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement throughout the entire region. Hitler's generals assured him their panzers would roll through the town in a matter of hours. They were wrong. The 101st Airborne Division, the famous Screaming Eagles, had been rushed to Bastogne as an emergency reinforcement. These were elite paratroopers, veterans of D-Day and Operation Market Garden, men who had jumped behind enemy lines and fought against overwhelming odds before. But even they had never faced anything like this. By December 20th, German forces had completely encircled the town. The 101st was trapped, along with elements of other units, about 11,000 American soldiers in total. The German commander, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, was confident this would be a quick victory. He sent a formal surrender demand to the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. The message was delivered under a white flag by German officers who were certain the Americans would see reason. After all, the situation was hopeless. The Germans had superior numbers, better equipment, and complete control of the surrounding area. Surrender was the only logical choice. McAuliffe's response became legendary. When his staff officers asked what they should tell the Germans, the general looked up from his map and said simply, "Nuts." The German officers who received this reply were confused and asked for clarification. An American colonel explained, "It means go to hell." The German officers departed, shaking their heads at American stubbornness. But McAuliffe's defiant response masked a desperate reality. His men were running out of everything. Ammunition was so low that artillery crews were rationing shells. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and wounded soldiers were dying from infections that could have been easily treated under normal circumstances. Food was scarce, and the bitter cold was claiming almost as many casualties as German bullets. Many soldiers suffered from frostbite so severe their feet turned black. Some men hadn't eaten a hot meal in 4 days. The weather was perhaps the cruelest enemy of all. The winter of 1944 was one of the harshest in European history. Snow fell continuously, creating drifts that reached chest-high in some areas. The cold was so intense that weapons jammed, vehicle engines refused to start, and soldiers' breath froze into ice crystals on their faces. Men huddled together in foxholes filled with slush and ice, trying to stay warm enough to keep fighting. The lucky ones found shelter in damaged buildings, but most spent those 6 days and nights in holes in the frozen ground, listening to the constant whistle of incoming artillery shells. German propaganda loudspeakers set up around the perimeter broadcast surrender demands every few hours. "American soldiers," the voices called out in accented English, "you are surrounded. Your situation is hopeless. Give up now and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Continue to resist and you will all die." Some of these broadcasts were accompanied by Christmas carols, a psychological warfare tactic designed to make the homesick soldiers think about their families during the holiday season. The psychological pressure was enormous. These men knew they were completely cut off from friendly forces. No supplies were getting through, no reinforcements were coming. Radio communications with headquarters were sporadic at best. For all they knew, the rest of the Allied army had written them off as lost. Some soldiers began to wonder if they should surrender. After all, what was the point of dying for a small Belgian town that most of them had never heard of before this battle? But something extraordinary happened during those 6 days of siege. Instead of breaking under the pressure, the 101st Airborne grew stronger. The shared hardship created an unbreakable bond among the men. Officers and enlisted soldiers shared the same dangers, the same cold, the same hunger. Rank became less important than simply surviving together. Stories spread throughout the perimeter of incredible acts of heroism. Medics crawling through enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers. Machine gunners holding their positions despite being surrounded on 3 sides. Engineers using their bare hands to dig foxholes in ground frozen solid as concrete. One of the most remarkable figures during the siege was a chaplain named Father Joseph Maloney. He moved constantly through the defensive positions, providing last rites to the dying, comfort to the wounded, and encouragement to the living. Despite the constant danger, he refused to take cover when shells fell nearby. "God will protect me," he told soldiers who begged him to be more careful. "My job is to be with you." His calm presence under fire became a source of strength for hundreds of men who might otherwise have lost hope. Meanwhile, 60 miles away, General George S. Patton was studying maps and making calculations that would have seemed impossible to any other commander. When news of the German offensive first reached Allied headquarters, most generals saw it as a disaster. Patton saw it as an opportunity. "The bastards have finally come out in the open," he told his staff. "Now we can get at them and chew them up." While other commanders were talking about establishing defensive lines and containing the German advance, Patton was planning a counterattack. But the counterattack Patton envisioned was audacious beyond belief. He wanted to turn his entire Third Army around and attack northward into the flank of the German offensive. This would require moving 133,000 men, 11,000 vehicles, and thousands of tons of equipment across 150 miles of snow-covered roads in the middle of winter. Military doctrine stated that such a maneuver would take at least 2 weeks to plan and execute properly. Patton claimed he could do it in 48 hours. The other Allied generals thought he was crazy. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower was skeptical. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was openly dismissive. "Impossible," he declared. "No army in history has ever executed such a maneuver in winter conditions." Even Patton's own staff officers had doubts. The logistics alone seemed overwhelming. How could they move that many men and vehicles along roads clogged with retreating refugees and damaged by German bombing? Patton's confidence was based on more than mere bravado. He had spent months drilling his Third Army in rapid movement and flexible tactics. His units were trained to move fast, adapt quickly, and maintain communications under the most difficult circumstances. More importantly, Patton understood something that the textbooks didn't teach. Sometimes the impossible became possible when the alternative was unacceptable defeat. On December 22nd, Patton received permission to attempt his audacious maneuver. That evening, he gathered his senior officers for what would become one of the most famous briefings in military history. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and tension as Patton spread out the maps. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never accepted defeat, "we are going to relieve Bastogne." The plan he outlined was breathtaking in its scope and complexity. 3 entire divisions would wheel northward, simultaneously covering different routes but coordinating their advance to hit the German flank like a sledgehammer. The 4th Armored Division would form the spearhead, their Sherman tanks and half-tracks pushing up the main road toward Bastogne. The 26th Infantry Division would attack from the east, while the 80th Infantry Division struck from the west. It was a perfectly coordinated triple envelopment that required split-second timing and flawless communication. "The enemy has made a fatal mistake," Patton told his officers. "They have concentrated their forces in a narrow salient, exposing their flanks. We are going to hit them where they don't expect it, with everything we've got. Speed is essential. Every hour we delay means more Americans die in Bastogne." He paused, looking each man in the eye. "I want those roads cleared of German forces within 72 hours. Not 73 hours, not 74 hours, 72 hours. The officers exchanged glances. What Patton was proposing violated every principle of military caution. Normally, such an attack would be preceded by days of reconnaissance, careful planning, and massive artillery bombardments to soften enemy positions. Patton was ordering them to attack immediately with minimal preparation, against an enemy of unknown strength occupying prepared defensive positions. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, raised his hand. "General, we don't have detailed intelligence on German positions along our route of advance. We could be walking into a trap." Patton's response was characteristic. "Colonel, the Germans don't have detailed intelligence on our positions either. The difference is we're going to be moving too fast for them to react. By the time they figure out what we're doing, we'll be past their prepared positions and into their rear areas." But the real genius of Patton's plan wasn't just its audacity. It was his understanding of how to motivate men to accomplish the impossible. That night, he drafted a message that would be read to every soldier in the Third Army. The message didn't focus on tactics or strategy. It focused on the men trapped in Bastogne, American soldiers who were depending on their comrades to save them. "Tomorrow morning," the message read, "we begin an attack that will be talked about for 100 years. Not because it is strategically brilliant, though it is. Not because it demonstrates superior tactics, though it does, but because it proves that American soldiers will never abandon their brothers in arms." 6 days ago, 11,000 of our fellow soldiers were surrounded by the enemy. They have held their positions against overwhelming odds. They have suffered cold, hunger, and constant bombardment. Some have died. All have suffered, but they have not surrendered. They are waiting for us. We will not let them wait any longer. The attack began at dawn on December 23rd. 3 divisions, 133,000 men, began moving northward simultaneously along roads that military experts had declared impassable. The temperature was still well below zero, and snow continued to fall steadily. Vehicle engines that had been running all night to prevent them from freezing solid lurched into motion. Tank! Treads crunched through ice and snow as hundreds of Sherman tanks began their advance. Half-tracks filled with infantry followed, their passengers huddled under tarps and blankets, rifles ready despite the bitter cold. The German reaction was exactly what Patton had predicted. Local commanders, faced with sudden attacks from multiple directions, didn't know how to respond. Radio communications were jammed or intercepted. Orders from higher headquarters were delayed or contradictory. German units that had been confidently advancing toward their objectives suddenly found themselves fighting desperately to avoid being outflanked and surrounded. But the advance was far from easy. German resistance was fierce, especially from SS units that had been trained to fight to the death. At the town of Chaumont, a single German tank destroyed 5 American Shermans before being knocked out by a bazooka team that crawled within 50 yards through deep snow. Near Neufchâteau, an entire American company was pinned down for 3 hours by a single German machine gun nest positioned in a church steeple. The gunner, wounded but still fighting, continued firing until the building was destroyed by artillery fire. The weather remained a constant enemy. Vehicles broke down regularly as mechanical parts failed in the extreme cold. Soldiers suffered from frostbite and exposure. Communication equipment malfunctioned. Supply lines stretched thin as fuel. And ammunition trucks struggled to keep up with the advancing combat units. Several times, tank crews had to push their vehicles through snowdrifts that reached above the track level. Meanwhile, in Bastogne, the situation was becoming critical. German attacks intensified as enemy commanders realized that relief was coming, and time was running out. On December 23rd, the Luftwaffe made a rare appearance, sending dozens of fighter bombers to attack American positions. The psychological impact was severe, as most soldiers hadn't seen German aircraft in months and suddenly found themselves under attack from the sky as well as from the ground. Medical supplies were completely exhausted. Surgeons operated without anesthesia, using melted snow to clean wounds. Men with minor injuries that would normally require evacuation to field hospitals instead remained at their positions, fighting through pain and infection. One medic, Sergeant Eugene Rowe, worked for 30 consecutive hours, treating wounded soldiers in a makeshift aid station set up in a bombed-out church basement. When he finally collapsed from exhaustion, other medics had to carry him to safety. Food became so scarce that soldiers began eating raw turnips they found in abandoned root cellars. Some units hadn't received any rations for 2 days. Water was obtained by melting snow in helmets held over small fires that had to be concealed from German observers. Hot coffee became a luxury worth fighting for. One company commander wrote in his journal, "The men are surviving on willpower and stubbornness. I don't know how much longer we can hold, but even as conditions worsened, morale somehow remained high. The men of the 101st had developed an almost mystical belief in their ability to hold Bastogne. Stories spread of impossible heroics." Private Joe Willis, armed only with a rifle and a handful of grenades, single-handedly destroyed a German tank by climbing onto it and dropping a grenade down the hatch. Sergeant William Guarner, despite having been wounded in both legs, continued to direct his squad's fire from a stretcher. When offered evacuation, he refused. "I'm not leaving my boys," he said. The most remarkable aspect of the siege was how ordinary soldiers rose to extraordinary levels of leadership. When officers were killed or wounded, enlisted men took command without hesitation. Corporals made decisions that normally would have been made by majors. Private soldiers showed initiative and tactical awareness that impressed even veteran officers. The rigid military hierarchy that existed in peacetime gave way to a fluid system based on competence and courage rather than rank. On Christmas Eve, something unexpected happened. The weather cleared for the first time in over a week. For the men in Bastogne, this meant they could see German positions more clearly, but it also meant German artillery observers could see them. However, the clear skies also meant something else. For the first time since the siege began, Allied aircraft could provide support. The sight of American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers appearing over Bastogne was like a miracle to the trapped soldiers. The aircraft immediately began attacking German positions around the perimeter. More importantly, they began dropping supplies. Parachutes filled the sky as bundles of ammunition, medical supplies, and food drifted down toward American positions. Not all the supplies landed within the perimeter, but enough got through to make a significant difference. The airdrop included a special Christmas message from Allied headquarters. It read simply, "You are not forgotten. Help is coming. Hold fast." For men who had begun to wonder if the outside world even knew they were fighting, these words were more valuable than the food and ammunition that accompanied them. But the most important development on Christmas Eve was happening 30 miles to the south, where Patton's spearhead was encountering the heaviest German resistance yet. The 4th Armored Division had fought its way to within 15 miles of Bastogne, but progress had slowed to a crawl. German commanders, finally understanding the magnitude of the threat to their flank, had rushed reinforcements to block the American advance. Fresh SS units, supported by Tiger tanks, had established a defensive line that seemed impregnable. This was the moment when Patton's unconventional leadership style made the difference. While other generals might have ordered their units to halt and regroup, Patton personally drove to the front lines. He found Lieutenant Colonel Creighton, Abrams' tank battalion, engaged in a fierce firefight with German positions near the village of Assenois. American tanks were taking heavy losses from concealed anti-tank guns, and the advance had stalled. Patton climbed onto Abrams' tank and studied the situation through binoculars. German positions were expertly camouflaged and mutually supporting. A frontal assault would be suicide. Flanking maneuvers would take hours to organize and execute. Time was running out for the men in Bastogne. That's when Patton made one of the most controversial decisions of his career. "Colonel," he told Abrams, "I want you to attack straight up that road. Full speed. Don't stop to engage individual positions. Just keep moving toward Bastogne." Abrams was stunned. "General, we'll lose half our tanks in the first 5 minutes. Patton's response was characteristic. "Maybe, but the other half will get through, and once we're past their prepared positions, we can roll up their flank from behind." What happened next defied every principle of armored warfare. 24 German tanks, supported by half-tracks full of infantry, charged straight up the road toward German positions. It should have been a massacre. The lead tank was destroyed within 100 yards. The second tank made it another 50 yards before being hit. But something extraordinary happened. The sheer audacity of the attack caught the Germans off guard. Anti-tank crews, expecting the Americans to take cover and maneuver carefully, found themselves facing targets moving too fast to track effectively. Tank after tank was hit and destroyed. But the survivors kept moving. The infantry, dismounting from their half-tracks under fire, attacked German positions with bayonets and grenades. It was old-fashioned infantry assault tactics supported by modern armor, and it worked because nobody expected it. Within 20 minutes, the German defensive line had collapsed. The road to Bastogne was open. At 4:45 p.m. on December 26th, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division made contact with American forces in Bastogne. The siege was broken. The first tank to reach the town was commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggis, who would later say it was the proudest moment of his life. As his Sherman tank rolled past the first American foxholes, soldiers emerged from their positions cheering and crying. Some men fell to their knees in relief. The reunion between the relieving forces and the defenders of Bastogne was emotional beyond description. Men who had maintained their composure through 6 days of hell finally broke down and wept. Officers who had led their men through impossible odds embraced soldiers they had never seen before as if they were brothers. The psychological relief was as important as the tactical victory, but the battle was far from over. German forces, realizing their offensive had failed, launched desperate counterattacks to try to cut the corridor leading to Bastogne. For the next week, fighting continued around the town as American forces worked to widen the narrow supply route and secure their positions. The weather remained brutally cold, and German resistance remained fierce. However, the strategic situation had changed completely. Patton's successful relief of Bastogne had not only saved 11,000 American soldiers, it had also dealt a devastating blow to German morale. Hitler's last great offensive had failed. The Wehrmacht's final reserves had been committed and largely destroyed. From this point forward, German forces would be in constant retreat toward the Reich. The human cost of the Battle of the Bulge was enormous. American casualties totaled over 89,000, including 19,000 killed and 15,000 captured. German losses were even higher, with an estimated 125,000 casualties. But the strategic implications went far beyond the numbers. Germany had gambled everything on one final offensive and lost. The war would be over within 4 months. For the men who fought at Bastogne, the experience created bonds that would last their entire lives. Decades after the war ended, veterans of the 101st Airborne would gather annually to commemorate their shared ordeal. They called themselves the Battered Bastards of Bastogne, and they wore that title with fierce pride. They had proven that American soldiers, when properly led and motivated, could accomplish the impossible. General Patton's role in the relief of Bastogne established his reputation as one of history's greatest military commanders. His ability to execute a complex maneuver under impossible conditions demonstrated tactical brilliance, but more importantly, his understanding of how to motivate men to extraordinary achievements showed his genius as a leader. He had taken 133,000 soldiers and convinced them that saving their comrades was worth any risk, any sacrifice. The battle also demonstrated the importance of small unit leadership and individual initiative in modern warfare. Throughout the siege, sergeants and corporals made decisions that affected the outcome of major operations. Private soldiers showed courage and tactical awareness that influenced the course of history. The rigid hierarchies of peacetime military organization gave way to a fluid, adaptive system that emphasized competence over rank. Perhaps most importantly, Bastogne proved that in warfare, as in life, the impossible sometimes becomes possible. When the alternative is unacceptable, the men of the 101st Airborne held their positions not because it was tactically sound, but because surrender was unthinkable. Patton's Third Army executed an impossible maneuver, not because the textbooks said it could be done, but because their comrades needed them. The legacy of Bastogne extends far beyond World War II. The battle became a symbol of American determination and the power of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things when properly motivated. It demonstrated that superior numbers and equipment, while important, are not decisive when facing opponents who refuse to accept defeat. In the years following the war, military historians would study the Battle of Bastogne intensively, trying to understand how such an unlikely victory had been achieved. They would analyze Patton's tactics, examine the logistics of his rapid redeployment, and study the factors that allowed the 101st Airborne to maintain morale under impossible conditions. But the real lesson of Bastogne cannot be found in tactical manuals or strategic studies. The real lesson is about the human spirit. It's about men who chose to endure cold, hunger, and constant danger rather than abandon their principles. It's about leaders who were willing to risk everything on audacious plans because the alternative was unacceptable. It's about soldiers who found strength they didn't know they possessed when their comrades needed them most. Today, the town of Bastogne is peaceful and prosperous. Tourists visit the museums and monuments that commemorate the battle. Belgian children learn about the American soldiers who died to liberate their country. But for those who understand the true significance of what happened there in December 1944, Bastogne represents something more profound than a military victory. It represents proof that when ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things, they often succeed beyond anyone's expectations. The men who fought at Bastogne were not superheroes or professional warriors. They were farmers and factory workers, students and shopkeepers, young men who had been thrust into a situation that would have broken many others. But they found the strength to endure, the courage to fight, and the determination to never give up. 6 hours surrounded by the SS, 6 days of cold, hunger, and constant bombardment. 5 minutes of orders from General Patton, and suddenly everything changed. The impossible became possible. The siege was broken, the war was won, and history was forever changed by ordinary men who chose to do extraordinary things.